County Commissioner Richard Boykin traveled to New York City on Thursday to beg the United Nations to intervene and stop the genocide occurring on the streets of Chicago among its black community. Boykin went on to suggest that he has no confidence in the leadership of Rahm Emanuel and his ability to handle the issue. County Commissioner Richard Boykin spent an eventful Thursday in New York City with officials from the United Nations. You may ask, and rightly so, what business a county commissioner from Chicago has with the United Nations. Well, Boykin was in New York City to request support from the UN Assistant Secretary General in order to ask for help. He wasn't there to ask for help with the economy of Chicago, or with the fact that Chicago has immense spending issues. He wasn't there to ask the United Nations to assist with Chicago's famous corruption problems, which have been a consistent issue since the Daley family first held the position of mayor of Chicago. No, he's there to ask the UN to send peacekeepers, hoping for help in quelling the quiet genocide in the black community. Boykin went to New York City to ask United Nations officials to come to Chicago to help figure out ways to stop the violence in the black community residing mostly in the south of Chicago. Boykin went on to say that he does not believe he can wait for current Mayor Rahm Emanuel to attempt to put another 1,000 police officers on the streets, and that he suspects even if Emanuel manages the monumental task, that putting more police on the streets may not be the correct answer to Chicago's violence issues in the minority community. Rahm Emanuel, mayor of Chicago, is beset on all sides with woe. His political allies like Boykin are abandoning him. No one is confident in his leadership. Corruption in Chicago is growing apace under his leadership, and now, local politicians are demanding that the United Nations keep the peace in his city. As of now, the United Nations has no plans for what they will do when they get to Chicago, but Boykin says that he hopes the UN will consider every possible avenue, including the deployment of UN peacekeeping forces. Boykin also took a few shots at Rahm Emanuel's ineffective leadership of Chicago, including stating that, "I know that the mayor may tout the fact that the number of people being shot is down, and the number of people being killed is down, but let me tell you, we've had over 600 people killed by gun violence already this year alone. That is a huge number." Boykin continued on to say of the United Nations that they've been able to help in places like Africa and abroad, where they've sent troops in and sent forces in to help protect minority and vulnerable populations, and so quite frankly I think the same can be said for here in Chicago. He also commented, "I'm talking about physical security. I'm also talking about maybe suggestions for what we can do in Chicago to help protect our minority populations. We are being, again, decimated by the violence that we see here in Chicago. I mean, this is really a genocide, and we have to do something to stop it. UN peacekeepers have been effective in stopping violent genocides in the Third World for decades. Surely, they will do better in Chicago. Surely, keen observers of the past history of the United Nations in stopping slaughters and genocides around the world will take note that they are terribly ineffective at accomplishing that mission. Indeed, the United Nations has almost never been able to unilaterally act to prevent violence of any sort. In the early 90s, the United Nations deployed to a little-known African nation called Somalia. There, they managed to do absolutely nothing, as local warlords repeatedly seized the shipments of food meant for the starving people. Their rules of engagement were such that they did little more than stand and watch as warlords even killed civilians to get the 50-pound sacks of rice meant to help with starvation in the region. It was the U.S. Army Rangers, Delta Force, and Marines that deployed to Mogadishu who attempted to make a change, culminating in the Battle of Mogadishu, chronicled in the film and book Black Hawk Down. From 1992 to 1995, the United Nations deployed to Bosnia and Herzegovina concerning an ethnic cleansing. There, they did absolutely nothing other than watch while the fighting was done by mercenary forces and NATO, including United States Special Forces, while the United Nations peacekeepers in Somalia handed over food to warlords. Task Force Ranger was hunting warlords who are starving their people to death for their own profit. Obviously, the UN did a great job solving hunger issues in Somalia, which remains a poor nation filled with starving people to this day. In 1994, the United Nations was in Rwanda when genocide broke out, and they were meant to act to stop an ethnic cleansing based on nose sizes. Instead, the United Nations units did nothing, losing 10 SOLRs and withdrawing without firing upon the enemy as they slaughtered fellow countrymen. Unabated, United Nations peacekeepers could be accurately described as worthless, but that is far too generous. The United Nations peacekeeping force mostly draws from member states, including those from the Third World. Due to this, almost any deployment involves accusations that the peacekeepers raped those they were there to protect. But still, it gets better. United Nations peacekeepers are not beholden to the laws of the nation they're in, nor to the laws of the United Nations, but rather return to their country of origin where they are tried for any crimes they may commit while deployed. Because of this, most UN peacekeepers are never punished for raping foreign citizens. Objectively speaking, anyone should be able to agree that Chicago has a violence problem, especially in their minority communities. The idea that the solution is the UN, one of the most corrupt and useless organizations in the world, is beyond absurd. If Chicago's violence is truly that bad, they can look into declaring a state of emergency and deploying the National Guard. That will likely result in much less rape than deploying the United Nations. While the United Nations was unable to secure refugee camps in Bosnia, the United States military, along with NATO allies, were stopping the killing. The UN proved ineffective once again. Further, allowing the United Nations to operate in the United States sets a bad precedent. The blue beret and helmeted peacekeepers have no business on our streets, and anything that gives the United Nations the impression that they can operate in our country is something that any freedom-minded American should be against. Chicago has problems, and the United States knows it. The United Nations is not the answer. As a general rule, the United Nations is never the answer.